Hello and welcome to this conference session. This one's called Building a Neuro Ninja Writer with Andrew Wright, who I'll introduce in a second. My name is Simone Greenwood. I'm helping out with the Golden Egg social team this weekend, and we've got Elizabeth in the background as well, who's helping out on the chat. So it's a We are trying to support Seven Stories this weekend, which is the National Centre for Storytelling. So you can see a green button at the bottom of your screen if you can make a donation at some point this weekend. I'm sure Seven Stories would really appreciate that. You'll also notice there's an Ask a Question box. Can we just minimise your screen a second? So we come back up just for a second. That's okay. So there's an Ask a Question box at the bottom as well. So I know you can chat all down the sides, but if you do have a question for Andrew, you can pop it in that Ask a Question box. And also, audience, you can vote questions up if you'd also like to hear that question answered. So feel free to use that box. Okay, I'm sure you're going to be as fascinated as I am to find out how we can use our incredible brain power, not just for writing, but in every aspect of our lives. And I know Andrew Wright is an expert on this. He's been he's been working in secondary schools for 25 years as a head, a deputy, a Senko, and he started his career as a biology teacher. He's also the founder of Action Your Potential, which aims to help people be the best that they can be using the findings of neuroscience and psychology. So yeah, this is going to be a really fascinating one. So thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us today. I'm going to mute myself and close my video down so it's all you. And I'll be popping back up later to help with questions. So thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us.
Thank you, Simone. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all well. Hope you can see me. Hope you can hear me. Hope you can see my screen. Hope you've had a good day so far. I have to apologise for the first 20 minutes. I'm not going to talk about writing at all. I'm going to talk about you. I'm going to talk about your brain. And in the second half, I'm going to talk about creativity. Everything you do, every single amazing bit of fiction you generate, anything you do is created by your incredible world building brain. So I'm talking to all of you as well, world builders, about thinking about yourself in a completely new way and seeing yourself in a completely different way. Now, you're an imaginative, creative bunch, so you should be able to hang on in there as I explore with you your incredible brain and explain to you what's actually happening as our brain builds our mind every day, and what we can all do to protect and support our well-being. So I'd like to thank, I'm going to go back one. I'd like to thank Imogen for inviting me to do this today. Just to give you a little bit of a biography of me. All of that stuff that Simone said was absolutely true. Action Your Potential has been around for 3 years now, and I'll explain a bit about that in a second. I'm a golden egger from a long time ago, back in 2013, 2014. And I'm still not published, but I'm still on that kind of road. But in the meantime, I seem to have set up this business, which is taking up quite a lot of time. So it's all about being a neuro ninja writer. And let me explain a little bit about neuro ninjahood in a second. Let me introduce me. So basically, forget all of the long things that are written down there. I'm a brain nerd, and my mission is to tell you the story of your brain, kind of speaking to you through the biases built into your brain, because we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as our brain presents it to us, and that version of reality shifts and changes all of the time. And because we've been living in that complicated neural net for all of our lives, we don't realize that actually we're not getting the complete information, and some of the things that our brain presents to us just aren't true. For example, the stories that our brain tells us about ourselves, our abilities, particularly, for example, when we're receiving feedback, when we're perhaps having a difficult experience, our brain can generate a whole set of responses which aren't helpful and actually not completely true. So Action Your Potential, our mission, working particularly, we do loads of work with schools, with children, with students, with parents, with teachers, and business leaders. We're working with over 100 schools across the UK, and our mission is really to turn every day into a masterpiece by making sure we're living in our brain, giving it everything that it needs and understanding what we are. So we can all spend our lives living as a brain bot. A brain bot is somebody just following their brain's programs and really not adapting and responding, or we can move to becoming a neuro ninja. And I want you to be thinking about yourselves as a neuro ninja writer. What is a neuro ninja? Basically, it's someone that lives in their head, understanding how their brain works, what it's doing, and responding with flexibility, emotional and cognitive flexibility. We are the only species on the planet that has that facility. If you wind the clock back 500,000 years, we weren't the only species on the planet with that facility. There were a bunch of other hominids wandering around, Neanderthals, etc. There were lots of other species of human at that point, but we're the only one left. We have got this incredible ability provided by our brain to mentalize our experience, for the brain to put its own thinking at the center of its cogitations. So that means our ability to explore our thoughts and emotions and adapt our response, not just react. And we'll also be talking a lot about metacognition. So we've got a website, it's actionyourpotential.org. On there is loads of nerdy stuff about brains, focus very much about the formation of daily habits and the changing of our brain. So mentalizing and metacognition, which is reflecting on learning and thinking, are massive evidence bases which have huge efficacy across the literature. And everything in this presentation is either from neuroscience or psychology and has a long track record of efficacy in research. There isn't anything here that isn't deeply researched and understood. And like I said, we're working with hundreds of schools now. We do, I don't know how many webinars I've done this week, maybe 50, 60 webinars, hundreds of people getting excited about their brains. And we're particularly passionate about putting the brain at the center of the education system. Yes, I know, I was shocked too. You would imagine an education system would put the human brain at its center, but unfortunately it doesn't yet, but that will change. So today we're going to be understanding our daily habits. We're going to be learning about how to deploy our calm down nervous system. Yeah, I didn't know I had one of those either. And how to use the tools that our brain has provided us to progress and accelerate our creativity. But first, we need to understand fully what and who we are. We are not what we think we are, because our brain constructs a version of ourselves, and the way it operates isn't the way it feels as if it operates isn't the way it actually is. So you just need to hang on in there. Like I said, you're creative people. You're good at suspending your disbelief. So hang on, suspend your disbelief for a minute and see yourself with new eyes. So who are you? We're going to be philosophical, and we're going to explore how the brain and the body and the mind, how the brain and the body project the mind. So let's just have a think about how we're all feeling. It has been an interesting year, hasn't it? We've spent an awful lot of time. We're now in lockdown 3, aren't we? Possibly the worst ever sequel. How are you all feeling? If your experience is similar to lots of people I speak to, you'll be feeling meh, a kind of level of demotivation. You might be very stressed and worried. You might find yourself experiencing lots of kind of emotions and feeling fairly exhausted. The current situation creates a number of issues for our brain, which I will kind of touch on briefly. What I'm going to teach you today is a technique you can apply daily to shift the balance in your nervous system, to apply metacognitive processes, thinking about thinking and thinking about feeling, to adjust and adapt your daily responses to improve your mood, your motivation, your well-being, your attention, your creativity, your engagement. We want to help you make every day a masterpiece. So does this well-being stuff work? Yes, absolutely. Thousands of studies across the world say so. And when you understand the science, you'll see why it works. The big problem we face in the 21st century is we have lost touch with what we actually are. We're living inside a paradigm. Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, the TV news. We've got a view of ourselves and the world which isn't right. And we're working inside a set of beliefs and ideas that don't serve us and don't represent the truth about what we are. So let's change that paradigm today, and hopefully as a result change your world. The first thing to be aware of is we're living in a nervous system that's got two halves, and this is fundamentally important because whatever half we're in, whichever half is activated, affects the responses that we give to the world. And this is fundamental. So those nervous systems dictate our mood, our motivation, our activity, our response level every day. And nobody really tells us about them. The other thing to kind of put alongside that is that physical and mental health are not separate. The brain generates the mind every day. I'm going to come back to this theme again a few times during the presentation. But that moment in the morning when you wake up and feel deeply groggy, that has a name. It's called sleep inertia. And the brain is going from a deeply kind of inertial state in sleep, and it's waking itself up. It's connecting itself up, and it's building that day's mind. The mind is built by the brain every day. What is the mind? The mind is a model the brain builds of its own operation. It's so it can communicate with itself about how it's doing in the world. Now, that mind doesn't contain everything the brain is doing. It hasn't got a readout of our blood sugar levels or our current pulse rate, but it's got lots of information about how we're doing, how we're communicating with people, how they're responding to us, what we plan to do next, how what we plan to do next links with what we've done previously. It is a model the brain builds of its own operation. Now, that is critical because when our brain changes in terms of the nervous system's activations, which half we're in, the mind changes as well. So we've got two nervous systems. We've got the react nervous system that gets us ready for action. Its biological name is the sympathetic nervous system. And we've got the parasympathetic nervous system, the response nervous system, which calms us down, lowers our blood pressure, gets us ready to reflect on the world, helps our body repair itself, helps our body digest its food. We need to live in that nervous system in a balanced way. 30% in our react system, getting us ready for the world, alert and attentive, the sympathetic nervous system, and 70% in our response nervous system, our parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the problem we all face in the 21st century is one of the things that sets off the react system is uncertainty. And lots of people are walking around stuck in their sympathetic nervous system. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So what does the react system do? That's the sympathetic nervous system. When it activates to enable us to perform. So mine is activating slightly now. So I've got a slightly dry mouth, but I'm hopefully making some sense. It activates when we're teaching, when we're playing competitive sport, whenever we're doing any sort of performance, or whenever we're dealing with a threat or some complexity that means that we need to take immediate action. The sympathetic nervous system, the ultimate version of it is the fight, flight, freeze response. So if a car comes bowling around the corner towards us, we leap out of the way, and it's the sympathetic nervous system that saves our life through a structure deep in our brain called the amygdala, which we'll come back to shortly. The other thing that causes the react nervous system to power up is uncertainty. Now, uncertainty for a brain is a problem. Basically, a brain is a prediction engine. It's trying to predict what's going to happen next. And it uses its previous experiences to predict what's going to happen next. And if you can't predict what's going to happen next, we experience uncertainty, and we feel that as anxiety. So anxiety is a normal response of any human brain to a new situation. So I'm sure there are lots of colleagues that are presenting on Crowdcast today for the first time, talking to agents and doing all the things that they're doing today for the first time. And they will have had lots of anxiety building up to this moment. That's because any brain experiencing a new situation where it can't predict what's going to happen will feel uncertainty, and we feel that as anxiety. And that turns on our react nervous system. So our heart rate increases, our inflammatory system gets ready to deal with any cuts and bruises because we might be being chased by a lion in terms of the sympathetic nervous system. And when it evolved back on the African savannah, it does all these things. It increases blood pressure, increases alertness, narrows our awareness to focus on the particular issue, keeps our alertness on that issue, makes our breathing much shallower and much quicker. Which means living right now in the midst of a pandemic, but actually just in the 21st century, virtually all day, our sympathetic nervous system can come on. We're living in a psychologically intense environment. Let's just forget the pandemic for a minute. Email comes in, not sure what that means. Deadline for work. How am I going to manage to get that done? Are my GCSEs on this summer? Are they not? Will that agent get back to me? Will they not? There is uncertainty on a stick in the 21st century for our brain. Bearing in mind, our brain evolved at a time where basically life was pretty simple. It was highly dangerous at times when a predator came careering through the tribe, or the tribe over the hill got very warlike. It was mostly pretty boring, and then it was terrifying. Then it was mostly boring, and then it was terrifying. And you get the kind of theme. Nowadays, while they're not mortal threats, uncertainty triggers the react nervous system quite subtly and turns it on. And that can be a problem because that nervous system changes the nature of the mind we get to live inside. So the 21st century is jam-packed full of VUCA, and VUCA upsets lots of circuits in our brain. VUCA is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. I don't know what's going to happen next, says the brain. Uh-oh. And it activates the react nervous system. But as you know, life is very complex now. There may not be a resolution in front of us. Certainly, you know, the shouting, running, and hiding that we used to do as ancestors probably is not going to deal with most of 21st century issues, even though we might feel like we want to shout, run, and hide from those things. Now, uncertainty on its own generates lots of negative emotions, cognitive distortions, which are highly charged bits of emotional thinking. We can wear ourselves out as we chase these worries around our head, worries that are linked to uncertainty as the brain tries to work out solutions. The solution to having a calm response is to get ourselves into our parasympathetic response nervous system, which does the opposite stuff. It calms us down. It helps our body digest food, repair itself. It's activated when we're asleep. It opens our awareness and puts us in a bit of our brain called the prefrontal cortex behind your forehead. It repairs your body. It restores your mind. It enables you to think broadly. It activates solution-focused circuits at the top of your head in the prefrontal cortex. So just have a think for a second. Where are you? I'm sorry, this has been a bit mangled by the transfer into Google Slides. Ask yourself the question, where have you been this week? Which nervous system have you been in? Have you been in your sympathetic nervous system? Where do you want to be? And how do you get there? So the second half of this first half of the talk is about what we need to do every day to make our nervous system hit that balance, that sweet spot. So let's talk about you, flavors of mind. Where is your mind at? Remember, your brain generates your mind. So our mind is the sum total of operations of our brain and our body. And whatever our brain and body are doing, particularly whatever our brain's up to, will pop into our mind a few milliseconds afterwards. The brain does everything, decides everything. It arrives in our mind a few milliseconds later. What it feels like to us is though we're in some sort of control center in our brain, driving our body around, but actually the mind is the image produced by the brain of its own operation. So it runs a few seconds behind the brain. The brain is doing stuff. The mind gets to catch up with what the brain's doing a few milliseconds later. So let's just look at an experiment that begins to explore this idea. And hopefully it will become clear really soon why I'm talking about this, because we're not what we think we are. We're much more sophisticated, and it determines the experiences we have every day. So this is a 1 minute neuroscience experiment from the 1980s called the Libet experiment. Hopefully you can hear it.
Put your hand in front of you and flex your wrist. You presumably first had a thought. Flex my wrist. That then caused your wrist to move. That's how it seems. But Benjamin Libet's experiments in the 1980s have cast some doubt on that. In his neuroscience lab, he wired up subjects to an EEG machine measuring brain activity via electrodes on their scalps, and then asked them to choose to perform a simple hand movement when they felt like it. He also got them to record the time at which they made a conscious decision to move their hands. Disconcertingly, he found evidence of brain activity initiating the movement hundreds of milliseconds before the conscious decision was reported. In other words, his experiments seemed to show that the conscious decision didn't cause the movement. The brain activity bringing about movement started before the individual willed anything to happen.
So that's pretty fundamental. I'm just going to slow that down. So 1980s, back end of 1980s, that experiment, the Libet experiment, has been repeated again and again and again. So that person is moving their hand and they are reporting that moment when they have that urge to move their hand. But that moment occurs milliseconds after the brain has already initiated the movement of their hand. Perfect example of how the brain activates, and then milliseconds afterwards, we experience that in our mind. It doesn't mean we don't have free will. It doesn't mean we aren't a complete person, but it does mean the mind lags behind the brain, and the brain generates our experience moment to moment through the mind that it projects. And the flavor of mind we get to live inside shifts moment to moment. I can give you a perfect example of that. If something awfully sad happens, we don't feel the same suddenly afterwards because our nervous system has reacted and responded, and then the mind we're living inside is different. Equally, if something great happens, the opposite happens and our nervous system shifts, the brain shifts gear, and the mind we get to live inside is different. So why am I going on about this? I'm going on about this because our body and our brain affect the quality of our mind moment to moment every day. And we can do a lot to change our mood, to change our motivation, to develop our well-being every single day by turning our well-being into a skill. 50% of how you feel right now, today, is down to what you've done in the last 24 hours. Our brain is a physical organ. It's connected up and wired up in lots of different ways. We've got those two nervous systems, and we need to spend, as we've just looked at, 70% of our lives in our parasympathetic nervous system, our calm down nervous system. Lots of people aren't. If you look out into the world, anxiety is rising, and there are lots of complicated reasons for that. Most of that reason is about complexity, increasing complexity in the world, and therefore increasing uncertainty. And there are lots of concerns generated by the brain about that uncertainty. If you think about it, I know we're living in the midst of a global pandemic and we don't feel enormously safe at the moment. If you just wind the clock back 200 years, we are much safer now than we have been as a species, than we were 200 years ago. 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, we are much safer now. And yet anxiety levels are rising. And that's not because there's kind of mortal threats out there, and accepting the fact we're living in a pandemic. And obviously it's a very stressful time because of that and very upsetting. But if you take the long sweep of history, anxiety levels should be dropping, but instead they're rising, probably on the back of that increased complexity in the world. So this is where the first Neuro Ninja skill comes in for you as Neuro Ninja writers, and that is do your rocks every day. I'll explain what that means. These are the 12 daily habits that we need to get right in order to balance our nervous system. We need to provide our brain with opportunities to do these habits every single day. 9 of these turn on that parasympathetic nervous system, activate the parasympathetic nervous system, move us back into the calm part of our brain. And we'll talk a bit more about that soon. So the rocks you can get on our website. There's a checklist on our website. So the rocks activate the parasympathetic nervous system. They connect the brain in lots of different ways. There are lots of different circuits in the brain. We'll talk about those shortly. All of those ones turn on the calm down system. So rock 1, sleep; rock 4, mindfulness, managing emotions, etc., etc. Basically, we can't live in the 21st century and just assume that we're going to get a balanced nervous system as a result. We have got so much uncertainty coming at us. we have to stop every day and make sure that we're engaging our parasympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, the react and respond nervous system come on automatically, but we can engage them as well, and we must. So just a brief overview of some of those rocks. We haven't got time to do all of them. Sleep, amazing for body and brain. We understand sleep now in very deep ways. People have been kind enough to sleep with EEG kind of caps on their heads, and we've learned a huge amount about sleep. What's happening in our brain when we sleep is our brain is encoding memory. It's cleaning itself. Glial cells that support neurons are contracting, allowing cerebral spinal fluid to drain through the brain and clean it out. Our brain is processing emotions during dreaming. So if we get less than 6 hours sleep, we are more anxious, more emotional, more socially clumsy the next day. The flavor of the mind we get to live inside is a different sort of mind than when a brain has had all of the revivifying experiences of sleep. 30% less memory, more socially clumsy the next day, less immune cells the next day. 70% of our immune system is built at night. Higher blood pressure the next day, higher blood sugar. I could do a whole presentation on sleep. I won't kind of go on about sleep now, but if you're struggling with sleep, get in touch. There's lots of things that you can do today to begin to build your sleep. Exercise, profoundly important for the body, amazing for the brain. Exercise improves mood. Exercise causes the brain to release a hormone called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor causes neurons to branch out and make more connections. These are dendrites. They connect with other neurons. You've got 86 billion neurons. They've got possibly 10,000 connections per neuron. More dendrites, more connections mean more flex, more tracks for the thoughts and feelings trains to move down. And particularly in our prefrontal cortex, the bit of our brain that manages the rest of our brain, and also in our memory system, the hippocampus. And then I just want to mention emotion, the importance of managing emotion. This needs to be taught in schools alongside English and maths. It's as important in terms of healthy brains and healthy minds. So emotion management is fundamental because for lots of complicated reasons, but a simple idea from neuroscience is that social and physical pain are registered in the same part of the brain. So physical and emotional pain registered in the same part of the brain. So you bang your leg, this area between the thinking part of the brain and the emotional part of the brain lights up. That's called the anterior cingulate cortex. Basically, if you've got a physical wound, you know what to do. You clean the wound, you avoid whatever it was that caused the physical wound. If you've got a social or emotional wound, that is in your brain. And if you don't do anything about it, if you carry that emotion around with you, it's going to affect the functioning of your mind. It's going to mean that you've got unprocessed emotional pain, which will reduce your cognitive output. Imagine trying to do a maths test with toothache. Emotional pain has the same impact on cognition as physical pain does. So we struggle to think straight. We struggle to understand complexity. We struggle to be productive when we're carrying emotional pain. And it's really important that we get to a space where we think about our emotions differently. You might have been told this when you were a kid at school: sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. That is not true. Nastiness, abuse affects the brain physically, affects the experience of our mental health. As the brain is affected physically, the mind is affected as well. And you could argue strongly, and lots of people in the literature do, that emotional abuse is actually worse than physical abuse. They're both awful, but the scars of emotional abuse are hidden. They're in the brain and they take a long time to heal. So how can we help ourselves daily? Well, first of all, brains that can process their emotional experiences can slowly but surely tame those experiences. Name it to tame it. And there are three particular emotional skills that we need to explore. One of them is called emotional agility, which is the ability of a brain to just be aware it's having thousands of emotional experiences every day. Now, emotions are the brain's first response to the world, and you can't control your emotions. It's an ocean. It's an emotion ocean. Your brain will constantly react to the world from the middle out. So level with our ears is the limbic system or the emotional system, and that responds to the world, and we get an emotional response. That's emotional agility. Emotional granularity is the skill of naming our emotional experiences and saying, I feel sad today because, I feel happy today because. Now, we're living in a brain that spots problems using anxiety and negative emotions. So we can't expect to feel great every single day. In fact, the resting state of a human mind, you could argue, is slightly grumpy, because slightly grumpy cave people got up off their backsides and got what they needed. Happy, blissful cave people would just sit around with their legs crossed, not pull their weight in the tribe, not get food, and starve. So actually, our brain is not designed for happiness. So if we sit there beating ourselves up all day saying, I'm not happy, actually, that is it's unfortunate, because we're not designed for happiness. We're designed for survival. We can find joy. We can manage our emotions. And the final emotional skill is emotional hygiene, which is basically checking in with ourselves during the day. What happened today? How did it make me feel? What emotions were involved? And we can begin that daily habit with our families. We maybe kind of do it in an informal way now. We just, check in with each other at the end of the day, but have a conversation with your kids a couple of hours shy of bed. What happened today? What emotions were involved? And explore those emotions. Often it's a very quick conversation. Sometimes it's not. Make sure you explore both the positive and the negative experiences. What you'll notice, upsettingly, there's probably more negative emotions that register. Doesn't mean we have more negative emotions, but they register because when we're having a negative emotional experience, our brain activates 3 times more powerfully. And that's a holdover from evolution, because worst case scenario brains that were a little bit anxious lived longer. If you're a happy, joyful cave people and you walk down a path thinking that noise behind the bush isn't a predator, you got eaten. So you didn't get to pass on that happy, joyful genetic state to the rest of us. So we're all evolved from cave people that were more nervous and anxious. I wonder if that one's going to play. It probably won't play, unfortunately, which is just actually very upsetting. So bear with me. I'm just going to upload that on a different YouTube. I'll come back and look at questions in a second. Right. Now, I'm going to need to reshare my screen, aren't I wonder. So if I wonder how if I do that, maybe. Sorry about this. A little bit clunky. And then if I do that, and I do that, and I do that. Sorry, we're going to have to sit through this ad. I'm sorry about that.
He doesn't care if you forgot to recycle. He doesn't care if you left your reusable shopping.
Okay, what you're seeing here, before we move in to talk about creativity and your writing brain, is the importance of managing emotional pain. We all have a responsibility to manage our emotional pain. Once we've learned about this stuff, obviously, a load of people haven't learned about this stuff yet and are carrying sacks of emotional pain.
A few years ago, I learned a very important lesson. Of all places, in the back of a Los Angeles Uber. We were driving in the right lane when all of a sudden, this gray SUV jumps out of its parking space right in front of us. The driver of the other car, the jerk who almost caused a big accident, had the nerve to get out of his car and start yelling at us. And you know what? My Uber driver just smiled and waved at the guy. And I mean, he was actually friendly. So I asked him, why did you do that? That guy almost ruined your car and he could have sent us to the hospital. And that is when my Uber driver told me about what I now call the law of garbage trucks. See, he said, most people are like garbage trucks. They run around full of garbage, full of frustration, full of anger, full of disappointment. As their garbage piles up, they need a place to dump it. Wow. Now that really got me thinking about how often I let garbage trucks run over me, and how I then take their garbage and spread it on to other people, at home, at work, on the streets. It was that day that I resolved I'm not gonna do this anymore. Since then, I started to see garbage trucks everywhere. Just like Doctor Strange could see all those possibilities in the future, well, I can now see garbage trucks. I see the load that they're carrying. I see them coming to drop it off, and just like my Uber driver, I don't make it into a personal thing. I just smile, wave, wish them well, and I move on.
Right, I'm going to reshare my other screen. So basically, that idea of managing our emotional pain every day, processing our pain, is incredibly important in terms of making sure that we're living in a balanced nervous system. So I urge everyone listening to this, self-care is not a self-indulgence. It is about being the best version of ourselves for those that we care about, for those that we serve, for our creativity, for everything that we want to do every day. And there are biases built into the brain that sometimes mean we don't do for ourselves what we would do for other people in a similar situation. When we're really struggling, having a tricky time, we are not kind to ourselves in the way that we would be to our friends. And we need to adapt that response. We need to apply self-care daily in this intense, complex 21st century in order to live in that balanced nervous system. So if we don't balance our nervous system with daily well-being, it can reduce our capacity for hope, creativity, positivity, learning, progress, and memory. I'll give you a really simple example. When our bloodstream is full of cortisol and adrenaline, that reduces the function of the prefrontal cortex. That is where a huge amount of creativity occurs, and we'll talk a bit about that in a second. Why is that? There's a little crawl. You've got complexity coming at you from every angle. Why does the brain, the solution focused circuits of the brain, power down at that point? You have to skip back through evolutionary time, because the fight, flight, freeze branch of our nervous system, the react nervous system, is ultimately designed to deal with mortal threats like the tribe over the hill or the lion coming towards us. And when you're running or fighting or hiding, you don't really need to be deeply philosophical. So the brain powers down and heads in a kind of emotional instant reaction space. So therefore, just at that moment in the 21st century, when we need our solution focused circuits because we're facing all that complexity, the react nervous system reduces it down. So we end up in a kind of tunnel space, overly emotionally thinking, reacting, shouting and screaming perhaps, and making a new problem as well as the one that's caused those situations. So the 12 rocks of well-being are the solution daily. You don't need to wait to the weekend. You don't need to wait to that holiday. We can't book them anyway at the moment. You certainly don't need to wait for retirement. You need to do your rocks every day, not simply to feel better, but to be more productive. Okay. That's the kind of first part. I just wanted to I'll pause for a second and maybe nip back and just see if there's any kind of questions that have come to the top of the pile. I'm just going to, I wonder how, I can do that and maybe close the screen. There's some good questions there. That's a good question about, there's a question about ADD. I can absolutely answer that. If you want to email me, I can give you loads of stuff about how you can build your focus incrementally. there's a powerful question about can someone who's been emotionally damaged be healed? Absolutely, absolutely. There's a process. And does sleep count as the react or response system? It does depend partly on the quality of sleep, but when we're asleep, it's the parasympathetic nervous system that kind of sends us there. So I will, because I've got 20 minutes, I will kind of carry on now, and then we'll come back and maybe answer some other questions in a while. I think this is being recorded, so hopefully if you've got any other bits you want to go back to, you're welcome to go back to them. And if you want to email me at any point, Golden Egg have got my details, but I'll put them in the comments at the end. So bearing in mind, the first job as a Neuro Ninja writer, your first job as a parent, as a co-worker, as a partner, is to get your self-care sorted so you can live in a balanced brain. The second job is to let your brain strut its incredibly funky stuff. Our brain is amazing, creative, playful, resourceful, a powerful problem solver, the biggest problem solver planet Earth has ever seen. So let's talk about the creative brain. Why is our brain so creative? Effectively, our brain is designed to solve problems out in the world, and it's a pattern and problem spotting, recognizing, and solution constructing machine. And part of that process of problem solving means that it will crawl over information that it's imbibed from the environment, encoded in its structure, and it will look for deeper and deeper layers of complexity, deeper and deeper solutions, and it will make connections between novel ideas. Throughout its entire life, it will smash ideas together to explore novelty. Because living in a group of 150, the power of a human species isn't an individual, it's the way we connect. Our brains are powerfully neurally diverse. Neurodiversity is often used to describe people on the special needs kind of spectrum. I speak as a dad of a young man who's got ASC, autistic spectrum condition. Everyone's neurally diverse. Every single human being is neurally diverse. And every neurally diverse profile has benefits and deficits associated with it. That neurodiversity is the secret of our success as a species, because everyone is needed, everyone is significant, everyone can contribute to the health of the tribe and the group. And one day, human beings will realize which particular bit of land we live on is irrelevant, and we are, in fact, the same family. So there's some neuro myths floating around. There's one out there about left brain and right brain stuff from the sort of 90s and 2000s. Basically what happens is people get really enthusiastic, understandably, about the brain. It escapes out into the world, and actually that kind of division of the creative right hand side of the brain and the logical left hand side of the brain isn't right. It's a very simplistic model, so simplistic as to be plain wrong. Let's talk about where neuroscience places us in terms of understanding the kind of power of the brain. If you want your brain to serve solutions and generate solutions to problems, spot patterns, develop stories, make links, it's a beautifully complex, connected network, a learning and survival matrix, effectively. If you give your brain repeated exposure to a problem or a pattern regularly, you give it rich feedback, say from an editor, you engage with enthusiasm in short bursts, could be as little as half an hour. You don't need to be there for ages. Sometimes it's best to just bung yourself in it for a bit and rip yourself out. We'll talk about that in a second. Attend deeply to what you're doing to a point where time collapses and you think, where did that hour go? Repeatedly return to that problem again and again and again, and space those experiences out over hours and days. You can do amazing things. You can construct beautiful things. So our mind and our brain are complex. They're like the weather or an ocean. A tiny change in a behavior, a tiny change in an event can affect the whole brain in the way that, for example, that butterfly effect idea, the flapping of a butterfly in the Amazon rainforest can cause a hurricane in Florida, maybe 15 days later. It's a chaotic, complex system, and tiny changes can affect the sort of experience of the mind we're getting to live inside every single day, as we looked at in the first half, that sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. Think of the pandemic, think of the fact that people aren't going into work anymore. They're working from home, and there are some advantages to that, and there are massive disadvantages to that. One of the disadvantages is you're not in work with colleagues in that problem space, having those social interactions you ordinarily have, that daily contact that you have. And if you live on your own, you've missed out on a massive collection of social interactions every single day. That's rock 9. That's connection with other people. Tiny changes can affect the state of our brain. Our brain isn't some unchanging biological machine. It's a living network sensitive to small changes in initial conditions or daily habits. So if we're going to build our creativity, it's really important to understand how our brain processes the experiences we have and processes the development of our story and the worlds that we're building. So our brain responds to events in the world and events in our heads, and it responds in terms of activation, starting in the middle of our heads, the sensory output of our heads, the emotional output of our heads, moving out, up, and across our brain. So the whole brain is affected by incoming information and also big thoughts and ideas that we have. It ripples out across the brain. Imagine the brain as a pond, and the idea or the event as a rock landing, and it ripples out, affecting different circuits at different times. And what the brain does with a big idea or a big event is it carries out two sorts of processing: bottom up and top down processing. So bottom up processing is emotions and sensory information coming up through the networks of the brain, and top down processing is higher brain circuits looking for patterns, trying to connect ideas from previous ideas, asking questions like, where have we seen something like this before? How does this link to a previous idea we've had? And the brain does this in an instant, a billion calculations a second. So where does creativity sit in the brain? Everywhere is the answer, but actually there's two particular networks I want to talk about now to how to kind of stimulate your creativity. So you've got a network behind your forehead called the prefrontal cortex. That's the solution focused circuits that activated when we're carrying out meditation and yoga, when we're reading, when we're focusing our attention. And then connected to that around the back and the sides and a little bit in the middle is something called the mind wandering network. That's when we're daydreaming. That's when we might be kind of brooding emotionally. The mind wandering network is trying to solve problems. When we can't concentrate and our mind's wandering off, our mind is trying to solve problems, and it needs us out of the way. It needs us not to be focusing while it gets on with that process. So mindfulness network at the front of our heads, we're in the present moment, we're focused in our solution focused circuits. And the mind wandering network, where our brain is off quietly searching for solutions and problems. And our brain will never stop trying to search for solutions, even when we don't think it is doing that. You've got that eureka moment in the shower where your mind wandering network produces a solution, and we claim it for ourselves, don't we? Oh, I have a great idea there. We did, but our mind wandering did it behind the curtain of consciousness quietly. So let's look at some ways you can unleash your creative mind. Embrace the idea of finishing hot and latent processing. So what do I mean by finishing hot? You're pouring through a draft and you just want to get to the end of that chapter. You just want to get that word count up. But actually, sometimes, you've got a busy life, you've got another job, half an hour a day, diving in, finishing hot, ripping yourself out of where you are in the middle of a sentence, a little note to yourself about where you got to, rip yourself out, go off and do stuff, let your brain, Imogen first talked to me about this back in 2013, latent process, churn. Your mind wandering network will chew away at that problem quietly. It will always do that. Finish hot, rip yourself out of it. Sleep, good sleep supports the prefrontal cortex, which is a fundamental part of creativity. It's much more difficult to get that kind of clarity without the prefrontal cortex's support. And obviously, dreaming is an incredibly powerful process. What's happening when we're dreaming is our brain is doing a couple of things. It's processing its emotions, and also it is being creative. It's smashing together experiences and generating novelty. And that's often when solutions can come to us. The phrase sleep on it exists in every language in the world because we kind of know intuitively that that's what the brain's doing. Part of the process of dreaming sleep is an algorithm smashing together creative ideas. Pose questions in your mindfulness network for your mind wandering network to answer. So, what's going to happen to protagonist? What's going to happen to character B in chapter 4? What's going to happen when those two people meet later? What's going to happen after the point of no return? Pose those questions to your mind wandering network, and effectively your mind wandering network churns away and chucks up lots of ideas. And the way I like to think about it is your prefrontal cortex fishes in the mind wandering network for ideas. Sometimes it pulls up an old boot. Sometimes it pulls up a rusty pram. Sometimes it pulls up a big, juicy, fat fish of an idea. And that's the best way to use it. Write the question down and trust your mind wandering network. Go for long walks. It activates the mind wandering network. Lots of creative types in history, lots of scientists in history. You look through Picasso, Darwin's history, long walks. Go for long walks. Let your mind wander. Put on some gentle music. Let your mind wander. Put on music that evokes the emotional tone of that particular part of your story, because our brain works on mood congruent attentional bias, which basically means whatever mood or tone we're experiencing at the time, our brain will access memories and ideas linked to that tone. Move more than you expect. Exercise a lot, refreshes attention, enables connections between the prefrontal cortex and the mind wandering network. Did that jump a slide? Yeah. Eat words of all genres. Get lots of words into your brain, because those top-down processing circuits will crawl all over those words, and it will boil down ideas, and it will find solutions to creative problems for you. So read widely, all of the time, not just the genre you're trying to get published in, not just that market, just read widely. Non-fiction, lots of experiences to let your brain process that information. Sorry, that's Siri interrupting me. It's really important to build in routine. Expect writing to be hard. When you are writing stuff, you are trying to grow new connections effectively. That's effort for the brain. Our brain really likes to avoid effort. If you don't make a plan for a day, if you don't have a routine for a day, your brain will do passive and easy stuff. It'll watch Netflix, it'll watch YouTube, it'll procrastinate, because procrastination is a final way of the brain saving energy. Making new connections, thinking deeply, is effort for the brain, and it's always trying to save energy. Unleash the 3 I's of growth and creativity and learning. Incremental every single day. I remember Ness talking to me about the fact that nothing in creativity is wasted, and that is so true. Incremental growth, iterative growth that builds on the increments, and then be involved in that process every single day. Read or write as much as you can. Plan your day. Write words. Nothing will be wasted. Let's face it, only 10% make it into the final book, but that's fine. Our minds are babblers, and they learn by trying, exploring, feedback, and developing. Oh, we've lost that video there. I'm sorry about that. Oh, I wonder if it'll play. I'm just going to finish on this video. So let's just see if we can find. Maybe we can't find that one. Actually, I might just go on to my final video. Actually, I think that might be too tricky to find. Okay, I'll share that link with you later. So, as I reach the end, what are you waiting for? You have everything you've got at the top of your neck. This should play. What we want is you to be the best for the world. We want you to be in a balanced nervous system. We want you to practice the rocks of well-being to get the most out of yourself. We want you to enjoy the incredible privilege of living in a human brain. Ignore its moaning. It does moan. Don't ignore its emotions. Certainly connect with those emotional experiences, but focus on making sure you're in a balanced nervous system, and you will be creatively unstoppable.
I have a lot of memories from when I was a child. One that's always stuck out to me, though, was when I was about 10 years old, and I was in school, and I struggled. And I didn't struggle with English, math, or science. I struggled holding still. And I would try to listen and focus and process ideas, but I couldn't help myself. And to be honest, I would sit there and then I would just start tapping. And the students in the class would look at me and they'd say, "Hey, stop tapping." A lot of the time, I didn't even realize I was doing it. And then eventually even the teachers got after me and they would yell at me and they'd say, "Clint, you have to stop tapping." It got so bad that I got sent to the principal's office for tapping. And he said to me, "Okay, maybe when you go back to class, just try sitting on your hands." So I did. I went back to class, and when I felt myself starting to tap, I did this. I sat on my hands. And that worked for about 5 seconds. One time I was tapping in class, and my teacher, Mr. Jensen, he looked at me and he yelled. And he said, "Clint, stay after class." And I thought to myself, this is it. I am done. Now, I've always been the type of person that believes that a single moment in time can change a person's life. And this was one of those moments for me, and I will never forget it. So I was sitting there with Mr. Jensen and an empty classroom. He walked past me and he sat next to his desk and he said, "Clint, come here. I want to talk to you." And as he looked me right in the eye, he said, "No, I need you to know something. You're not in trouble. But I do have just one question that I have to ask you." And he asked, he said, "Have you ever thought about playing the drums?" And in that moment, Mr. Jensen, he leaned back and he opened the top drawer of his desk. And he reached in and he pulled out my very first pair of drumsticks. And he held them in his hands and he looked at me and he said, "Hey, Clint, you're not a problem. I think you're a drummer." From that moment on, I've never put those sticks down. I've toured, recorded, and played drums all over the world. My whole college education was paid for with drumsticks in my hand. Just because of a single moment in time when somebody believed in me. And he saw something in me that I didn't even see within myself. And from that moment, I learned that there's a difference between being the best in the world and being the best for the world.
So you're all enough. You don't have to be anybody else. There's your weekly rocks checklist. Do your rocks, people. Thank you for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was so fascinating. And what really struck me as well, shall we unfocus that? Brilliant. What really struck me as well as learning things for our lives as writers, I think it's really interesting to think about our characters as well. You know, there was that thing with the respond and the react and where you are on that timeline or that chart, to think about where your characters are as well in particular scenes and particular moments. That's really fascinating as well. We haven't got long, we've got a couple of minutes. Let's just see if there's any questions. So I think you answered Laura's question about does sleep count? So there's a quick question from Michael. Has anyone ever tried to be faster than your brain in a scientific experiment? That I think that's in regard to that. Is it Labette experiment?
Yeah, it's not possible because your brain is doing the activating. You're seeing the kind of after image of what your brain's done in your mind. So your mind is the image projected by your brain. So it runs behind. It feels like it runs ahead, but actually it's the brain doing the stuff. The mind is just a model. It's a little bit weird.
And then there's a question from Bananas. Am I correct in saying being creative turns on the parasympathetic system? I always, more often than not, feel better after being creative. So having that, like that time to be creative actually increases your mood.
Totally, absolutely. So your prefrontal cortex is a big fat part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So once that's doing its funky stuff, you're being creative, you're focused in the moment. That is, was probably one of the moments when the brain is most at peace, when it's focused and doing stuff.
And there's the question from the beginning about ADD. I know you said you had some information for Mathilde. Are you able to, I know you've got, do you want to tell them a bit about your website and where they might be able to contact you?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll give you my email. So if you just email me, adwright100@gmail.com, there's a kind of way that you can organize your day depending on how much attention your brain gives you. You can manage your brain, particularly looking after your prefrontal cortex. Where's the chat actually? Oh, it's over here. I'll put my email over there.
Thank you, Andrew. We're going to have to end it there because we've got to get on to the next session on this channel. But yeah, I just want to say thank you so much. That's really fascinating. I'm sure all the audience will want to say thank you as well in the chat. And then do you want to can you type in your website as well? Because I'm sure they can find out more from your website. Just to remind you again, if you are able to donate to 7 Stories, the National Children's Storytelling Centre, I'm sure they'd appreciate that. And hopefully you'll be able to join more conference sessions. We've got 3 more sessions happening starting at 3:30, and then we've got more tomorrow. We've got another 15 sessions happening tomorrow, so join us for those. Thank you so much, Andrew. That's been fascinating, really fascinating. After all this is done, I'm going to go off for a walk so I can process it all, and I'll be rewatching
Look after yourself, and thank you, Simone, for looking after me so well in this virtual space. It's gone really well, isn't it? There's not been too many.
Yes, it's been brilliant. Yes, I know. Fantastic. Thank you so much, and goodbye, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference. I'm going to end it now. Bye.